So, welcome to this webinar on menopause in training. In terms of what we'll cover today, quick intros from me, but also to get to know you guys on the call. I'll be then covering some of the main impacts of menopause, particularly as how they relate to our training. Then I'll be taking you through my big three for addressing some of those impacts of the menopause, which, spoiler alert, are strength training, eating enough and recovering enough, but I'll obviously go into way more detail on all of those. And then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. I hope in terms of the session that I'm doing today, obviously there's lots of negative menopause effects, and those are the kind of well-known ones, but I hope it will also be, you come out of it feeling positive that there's actions you can take, but also that some of those actions are actually can be quite positive in terms of the changes that we're making. In terms of myself, lots of you know me, but if you don't, my name's Lucy. I'm the owner of Feel Fit with Lucy. I am an endurance coach, so I write training plans for people from 5K up to Ironman and beyond. I'm a British Triathlon and Training Peaks certified coach. I'm a personal trainer. I'm a coach with York Triathlon Club now, and I used to be with lots of different clubs down south as well. I'm also incredibly passionate about the importance of mindset as it relates to our exercise. So I'm a mental health and exercise coach, and that's part of my passion for both making sure that we get the mental health benefits from exercise, but also that so that we can sort of harness our mindset to get the most out of our exercise and the rest of our life. And related to that, I'm also now training as a life coach or a transformative coach, again, working on that potential of our mindset so that we can get the most out of our life. In terms of my own sporting stuff, I've done age group triathlon, I've done far too many Ironman, I've done far too many ultra endurance cycle rides, endurance Audaxes, ultra races. In terms of what I'm not, I am not a gynecologist, I am not a GP, I'm not an endocrinologist, I'm not a dietitian, I'm not a specialist in any of this. But what I am is somebody who's incredibly passionate about working with my clients, many of whom are perimenopausal or menopausal or postmenopausal, and supporting them in the best way that I can. And that's the information I'll be sharing today, the stuff that I think every woman should know, particularly every active woman, to support them in their training. What I'm also not going to be doing tonight is giving you specific advice for you. This is a general talk to people in general. We had almost 70 people signed up. There's about 20 people on the call right now. But I'm going to be giving generalized advice. So there's some things that you would need to check maybe with a GP or a specialist for you to make sure that advice is going to be relevant for you. Okay, so over to you, and this is when I realize all of the views have changed on here. Wait one sec. So it would be really useful for me just to have an idea of who I'm talking to, whether you're primarily a cyclist, a runner, swimmer, whatever. I'm going to put up a quick poll in a minute, so get ready with your fingers to hit the answers there. When I say, are you a cyclist or a runner, I don't say that with any judgment or sort of you need to prove that you're good enough. If you run, you are a runner. If you cycle, you're a cyclist. That's all I mean. I don't mean have you got awards for it or anything like that. So the poll that will come up, asking what you do in terms of sporting stuff, tick as many as apply to you, how often you do it, again, no judgment, just so I have an idea, and also whether when you are doing training, whether you are doing that primarily because you want to get faster, it's about performance, or because you're doing it because you want to be healthier, it adds value to your life, for your mental health, whatever. You can, I can't remember how I set it up, you might be able to tick both of those. So let me get the poll up. Oh, sorry, it keeps on disappearing. Yeah, right. There we go. Can you see that? Perfect. So yeah, if you just have a go answering, ticking any of those sports that you do, and then how often you do them, and what's your primary reason for training. I'll just give you a minute to fill that in. I don't know how Heidi is managing to scribble all over my screen. I don't know if that's deliberate or not. Um, don't know how to stop that. But anyway, Heidi doesn't like some of those thoughts. Okay, everybody filled in. So I think it'll come up and share to you, but I'll just quickly verbally share it in case it doesn't. Lots of walking, hiking, yoga and Pilates, lots of triathlon, bike, swim, run, lots of running particularly. Most people, wow, most people, I think the most popular is 5 times a week, and most people are doing it for quality of life. That coming up so you can see that now? Yeah. So that's really useful. Thank you. Just so I've got an idea of who I'm talking to, but also so you've got an idea of who else is on the call. So, next question for you guys. Where are you on your menopause journey? Has everybody else got the red lines from scribbles all over there? Yeah, don't know how to get rid of that. So, where are you on your menopause journey? If we imagine menopause, and this may not be a metaphor that works for you, but if we imagine it as a kind of typhoon or a cyclone approaching, you're either sort of sitting here going, I know it's coming, it's not really touching me yet, but I can see it coming in the distance. Or you're in the middle, it's just starting to touch you, the wind's whipping around, you're starting to feel the effects, but it's not really kind of got you in its full throes. Or it's got you and you're upside down and you've no idea which way is up, which way is down. You're definitely right in the eye of the storm. Or maybe you feel you are right in the middle of menopause, but it's not actually affecting you that much. Or it's passed through, you're still slightly kind of reeling from the effects, but it's passed over and you're sort of sitting there and going, okay, what happens next? So again, sorry, cursor has not been sensitive. I'm trying to get another poll to come up. There we go. Oh, right. So if you want to just fill that in again, so I've got an idea of who I'm talking to, and also so you get an idea again, sort of who else is on the call. Okay, we've got about 15 people filled that in, so I will end that and share that. So most common is the full-on effects, but also quite a lot of people who are approaching but not hit yet, and that's absolutely brilliant that people are kind of waking up to the fact that there is stuff we can do about it if we know about it in advance and if we know what to look for. So really good, those of you who are sort of taking action before the tornado hits. Oh, sorry, I didn't share that, did I? There we go. Yes, I did. Right. And then finally on to, right, can get rid of that. Okay, so in terms of the impacts of menopause, just to share a few quick definitions, and I'm not going to be dogmatic about these definitions. Absolutely don't worry if you're using the wrong words, but just so that we've got some definitions. So menopause, strictly speaking, is just one moment in time. It marks the point at which you've had a year without a period. In the UK, the average is 51 years old, but it ranges pretty commonly from about 45 to 50 years old, 55 years old, sorry. That menopause can be naturally, medically, or surgically. I would say my experience, both personally, but in terms of my client, is much more in terms of the naturally side. Most of what I talk about today would still apply in a medical or a surgical context, but I do I know a lot less about that, so I wouldn't want to kind of make any claims on that side of things. Then perimenopause is the thing that actually we normally are talking about when we say menopausal or I'm feeling menopausal. This is the point at which our hormones start changing. Perimenopause typically lasts about 4 years on average, but it can be 10 years or more, and it can be as little as 4 months. And then after we finish going through perimenopause, as I say, we get to that point of menopause, we enter postmenopause. And postmenopause is basically the rest of your life. It's the point, all the things I'll talk about today are still relevant because those hormones that are going to be going down through perimenopause, they go down and they stay down. So all of the hormonal changes will still apply, but the difference is that things aren't fluctuating. So in perimenopause, things are all over the place fluctuating. When we get to postmenopause, it's basically fairly static. Postmenopause is probably about 50% of the female population, and females are about 50% of the population. So about 25% of the UK population, very roughly, are postmenopausal, which makes it absolutely astounding how little we talk about this. And I know that is changing now, thank you, Davina, but it's absolutely astounding how massive an issue this is and how little we ever talk about these things. Those are the averages, but we're not all average. So 1% of women will reach a natural menopause before they're 40. There is a big well, not a big difference, but there's definitely differences in terms of the age of menopause, but also the impacts that we'll experience based on race, and also based on lifestyle and exercise. So smoking and alcohol and weight gain can increase the impacts, and a healthy diet and exercise can decrease the impacts. And that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. In terms of common symptoms, so a final poll for you. There we go, I'm getting a pro at it now. That should be coming up now. So these are some of the most common symptoms. Again, if you'd be happy, and it is, as I say, anonymous, it won't share your details on here, but if you'd be happy to go through any of those that are impacting you, the first question is any that you experience, and then the second one is which, or all the same symptoms again, but which do you experience has the biggest impact on you. Obviously, if you're not yet experiencing any symptoms, then you don't need to tick any of those. As you do that, oh, sorry, yes, I have launched it. Is it up? Can you fill it in? Yeah. So I'll just leave you to fill that in. And if you're watching on the replay, then obviously just have a read through of those symptoms. So I think, again, most people have filled that in, and let me share that with you. So lots of people experiencing lots of symptoms: brain fog, issues sleeping, fatigue, and I know definitely from people who filled in questions before joining the call, fatigue was a big one. In terms of the most sort of severe one that's having the impact, sleeping again, mood changes. Yeah. So, and that's kind of similar to what I experience talking to clients. Interesting that the joint pain and muscle pain is fairly low. That's often one of the ones that comes up as kind of one of the biggest impacts. But all of those symptoms there can be things that we experience as a result of menopause. Obviously, they're all things, or not all of them, but most of them are things that you could be experiencing anyway. And that makes it one of the hardest things to do with menopause or perimenopause, that we start going, is this just my body? Is this my body going mad? Is this just a phase I'm going through, or is it perimenopause? And we go round in circles trying to work out what's going on. In terms of those symptoms, 80% of women experience symptoms of menopause, 25% have severe symptoms, and 80%, and I think this is probably changing again, but 80% of women didn't realise their symptoms were related to menopause. Whilst I think that stat, again, thank you, Davina, is changing and people are more aware of menopause, I think there's still this tendency, and it's sort of a thing that women do particularly anyway, to kind of go, oh yeah, I think it's menopause, but it doesn't matter, or it's not that bad, or I don't need to do, I don't want to make a fuss about it. And if you are experiencing some or a lot of those symptoms there, there are things we can do about it, and it's probably time to think about, do I want to take action on it, rather than just, oh, I'm not sure if it's really an issue or not, I don't want to bother my doctor. 1 in 10, and this is one of the stats that really upsets me, 1 in 10 women give up their job because of the menopause, and 1 in 4 consider it, which is enormous. And 30% of women are less physically active post-menopause. And as I hope I'll show you today, being physically active can really help us to reduce some of those impacts of menopause. And, that's basically, that stat is my inspiration for being here now doing this talk and trying to talk and raise awareness around menopause and what we can do about it. In terms of how to know if it's menopause, lots of people will say to me, and people when they sign up for this talk sort of said, I'm experiencing this and that and that. Is it menopause? One of the main pieces of advice I'd probably give you, and I say this to all my clients way before we get to menopause, but is to track your symptoms through your menstrual cycle. That means that you can tell, you start to spot patterns. Not always, sometimes it's just kind of like that hurricane and you don't know if you're coming or going, but often there are patterns to things. There will be months where one thing starts to happen, then the next thing, then the next thing. So the more that we track our symptoms, the more aware we can be of those patterns. And that doesn't mean we kind of go, oh God, it's happening and I'm going to have to give up on life for the next month or whatever. But it means we're aware. It's like a weather forecast. If we know it's going to rain, we can take an umbrella with us. So we're more prepared to deal with it. We don't need to know, we don't have to have a diagnosis, but certainly having an understanding of what's happening is going to help us know how we can take action to address it. You don't need to, if you were to go to your GP, you probably won't need to have a blood test if you're of an age that kind of corresponds with menopause, and particularly if you've got those symptoms and you can show the doctor these are the symptoms I'm experiencing, you probably won't need a test in order for them to diagnose you. Okay, so on to addressing the negative impact of menopause in terms of our training. Now, I debated this next slide and I don't want to get too technical. I'm going to keep it fairly light, and it is a bit of a depressing slide, but I think it's important to put things in context. So we'll go through depressing stuff. It gets a little bit sciencey. It'll all be quite top level, and then we'll move on to the solutions. So in terms of the sort of potential impact of hormonal changes, particularly in terms of our training, when we start going through menopause, our hormones, our female sex hormones predominantly, so estrogen and progesterone, start declining. They start going down, but they don't just go down in a linear way. That would almost be easier to deal with. They go down and they go up, and they go down and they go up, and they also fluctuate in terms of the ratio of one to the other, which leads us to these constantly changing impacts. So we don't kind of know what's going on because everything keeps on changing the whole time. In terms of some of the kind of main effects, as estrogen decreases, estrogen has a protective impact on our muscles, on our bones, and on our tissues, as in our kind of tendons and our ligaments and things. As estrogen decreases, therefore, we start to lose muscle mass, or it's harder to maintain our muscle mass. Our bone density starts to go down, and therefore we're more vulnerable to breaks in our bones. And our tissue strength or our tissue quality goes down, so we become more vulnerable to injuries, tendonitis, injuries maybe around our hips, our shoulders, where the tendons, where the ligaments aren't supporting our body so well. That's all kind of has an impact, obviously, on our training performance, on our quality of life, and potentially long-term on our life expectancy. But that reduction in muscle mass is particularly concerning because it leads to weight gain. Now, most people don't like putting on weight purely from an aesthetic point of view, and that can be really upsetting and that can cause a stress. And perimenopause tends to be a very sort of stressful time. But it's also important because as we start putting on weight, we tend to put it on in the perimenopause because of changes in cortisol levels. We tend to put it on more around our stomach. And as we start putting on more weight around our stomach, that's that visceral fat, which long term can lead to things like type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease. That's not saying we're all going to get that by any means whatsoever, but it's a risk factor, not just because we don't want to put on weight, we don't like the sort of sight of it, if that's the case for you, but because it's dangerous for our health. So we want to try and minimize that weight gain that tends to go through, that tends to be associated with menopause, particularly that weight gain around the stomach. As we decrease in estrogen as well, estrogen has a protective effect on insulin. So insulin's the hormone that that moderates our blood sugar. So it takes it out of the blood and stores it in our muscles effectively. That's a very simplified version. And as the estrogen goes down, we therefore end up with that blood sugar fluctuating more. So we get these energy highs and lows, but also rather than being stored in the muscle, we end up storing it as fat instead, because the insulin isn't doing its job to store it in the muscle, but also because we've got less muscle. So all of that's leading to that weight gain, which, as I say, relates to potential health impact. At the same time, we've got progesterone going down, again, fluctuating, but generally going down. Progesterone is helpful in terms of sleep. It helps to calm us down and it helps to calm down our nerves. And so as we decrease progesterone, we start getting higher anxiety. We find it harder to sleep. Those two obviously go hand in hand in a vicious circle. And again, all of those can impact in terms of weight gain, in terms of lower quality of life, ultimately life expectancy, and can have a negative impact on our training. There's a load of other things going on as well, load of other things, particularly stress hormones increasing, which can have a negative impact on our body. But that's a kind of quick summary. As I say, that's as technical as we're going to get, and hopefully as depressing as we're going to get. Before we go on to what I would sort of my advice in terms of how we can address things in terms of our training, I think it's important to touch on menopausal hormonal therapy, or HRT as we call it generally in the UK. Not because I'm here to say you should take it or shouldn't take it or anything. I certainly wouldn't be giving you advice, but I think it's still important to restore some balance into the conversation. Again, things are changing. I think there's a lot less negativity around HRT, but there still is that kind of dominant narrative that, oh, won't it give me breast cancer or a stroke? And that comes from the fact that back in the early 2000s, there was two big studies, one in the UK, one in the US, which looked into the impact of HRT. I think most people these days would agree that those studies were poorly conducted, but particularly poorly reported. So they were taking, for example, women who were already over 60, already had health conditions, and therefore were more likely to be suffering some negative impacts from HRT. They were also on older forms of HRT, not the ones that predominantly people would be taking these days. So the NHS guidance now is that HRT is safe and effective treatment for most people going through menopause and perimenopause. The caveat to that is that if you're over 60, or if it's 10 years since you reached menopause, that point in time, then it may not be so safe, or certainly the risks increase, and you would definitely need to be taking advice from your doctor on that. I think people still have that kind of, oh, but I don't want to take something. I'm not sure if I should bother taking something. And again, I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other, but I would encourage you to look at the risks versus the risks of inaction. In terms of the risk, for example, just to put it in context, the risk in terms of breast cancer, there is a very small risk in terms of an increased risk of breast cancer. If you have a predisposition towards breast cancer, if you have a family history, that would be potentially different for you. But if you're part of, normal general population, the increased risk of breast cancer is the same as the risk of drinking 1 glass of wine a week. Most people I know drink probably at least 1 glass of wine or the equivalent a week. So there is a risk, but it's a risk we take in other areas. It's a very small risk. I would say, what about the risk of inaction? If we go back to that previous slide, all the potential negative impact of perimenopause and menopause on you, and particularly the fact that stat about 30% of women become less physically active as a result of perimenopause, all of that could have a far more significant impact on your health than the potential small negative risk of the HRT. In the States, and we're obviously not the States, but in the States, the highest risk, the highest cause of death among women of a perimenopausal plus age is coronary heart disease and type 2 diabetes. We're not the States, but certainly everything we see at the moment in terms of UK health stats, we're going in that direction. So we want to do what we can to maintain our activity levels, and HRT might be the key to allowing you to do that. As I say, absolutely not trying to influence you one way or the other, but just trying to restore a balance in the discussion. Whether you take HRT or not, it is not a magic wand. Everything I say today is something I would advise you are looking into and acting on, whether you're on HRT or not. And also, just to say it here, because I couldn't find anywhere else to put it in the talk, even if you don't want to do HRT, but if you do suffer from vaginal dryness, you can get a locally active, topical acting vaginal estrogen, which can help in terms of vaginal dryness. So that's just one extra little point to put in there. Okay, I am going to get onto my 3 steps in 1 second, but first of all, just in terms of your mindset as you hear what I'm talking about. Basically, most of the things I'm about to say to you today will not be new to you in any way. They are things you will have heard at various points in your life before. But when we get to the point of perimenopause, we start to get to that point where we can't get away with it anymore. So things like, we all know we're meant to warm up before we go for a run, and we never get round to it. As we get to this point of perimenopause and onwards, we start to have more issues if we don't do that, just as an example. You can approach that with a mind saying, oh, it's not fair. I got away with it before. I never had to do this before. I don't know why I have to do it now. It's not fair. Men don't have to do this, or they don't have to do it yet until they get a bit older. Or you can say, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to change things in your life for the better. If you think of somebody somebody who is, significantly older than you, and they'll either be somebody who you go, wow, they move so well still, they're still so active, it's amazing, or you see them shuffling around and they look old. what you do in your training, in your lifestyle, can determine, not a guarantee, but can help determine which of those paths you go down. So see this as an opportunity to start working on things which will help towards your long-term health, your long-term longevity effectively. So rather than doing oh, I have to everything I talk about today, try instead and frame it in terms of I choose to. As I say, when we go through this, some common reactions that I'll get are, but it worked before, and so I just need to try a bit harder. Remember, what you did before was based on one set of hormones. Your hormones are changing, and as I say, declining, as in progesterone and estrogen, not all hormones, but they are changing through this cycle. And so what worked before won't work anymore. So rather than trying harder, maybe it's about trying something different. Don't keep repeating the same thing and hope that you're going to get a different result. See if there's something that we can do to change that can lead to a different result. As I go through this talk, and I asked you when you signed up to it to let me know kind of how much you already knew about menopause, most people said they didn't know that much. Some people said they knew a lot. So there's a wide variety of people on this call or listening to this on the replay. So there's lots of information in here. Please do not hear everything I say and go, oh my God, I need to do all of that. Because if you do, you will be overwhelmed. You'll think about doing it for a few days and then you'll give up on it. So instead, choose where you are on that journey. Have you started making any changes? If not, start making a few. If you've made a lot, then see what are those kind of further detail you can make to try and have an impact. But don't try and take on everything. And I've got a slide at the end that will hopefully help to break things down. And then the other common reaction is, well, that's interesting. She's talking about me when I get old, but that's the future and I don't need to worry about it yet. I would strongly urge you to think about some of these things now. If you do them now, you will have more benefit because you will be, putting them into action sooner. But also there is nothing that is going to get any easier when you reach a magic age when you think you should do something about it. If you wait till you're 65 to start strength training, if you don't want to do it now, you're not going to magically want to start doing it when you're 65 or whenever. So I would suggest, my advice would be to start trying to put some of these things into practice now. You don't have to do them all tomorrow. Do one a month, one a year, whatever, but start putting them into practice now. Okay, so actually on to the big three. So number one, strength training. I've already talked about how we lose muscle mass and bone mass as we go through menopause. Few stats for you. So average weight gain through menopause is 2 to 3.5 kilos. And as I say, most of that is around the stomach. I heard somebody speaking the other day saying only 2% of people won't experience weight gain. Muscle mass decreases by up to 8% each decade from our 30s, and it accelerates after 60, and we can lose up to a fifth of our bone density through menopause. Our VO2 max, so kind of a measure of our cardiovascular fitness, declined by about 10% per decade after the age of 30. Of the 4 million people in the UK with osteoporosis, 80% are women. And of women over 50 years old, there's a 14% likelihood of getting a hip fracture compared with only 5% of men. And this is a US stat, but I don't think it's that different in the UK. If you're over 65 and break a hip, there's a 30 to 40% chance of dying within a year. So I hope that kind of puts into context why it's so important to be working on our muscles so we're more stable, so we're less likely to fall, on our bone strength, so we're less likely to break a bone, on our balance, so we're less likely to fall in the first place. Over 50% of women over 50 experience urine leaks. Up to 80% of active women experience urine leaks or pelvic floor issues. So that kind of puts in context everything I'm about to say. I'm not going to go through this in loads of detail. As I say, you'll get the slides through afterwards, or feel free to take a photo now. My main recommendation is that we start doing, or we do more strength training. So by strength training, I mean working our muscles. Ideally, that would be big multi-joint exercises, things like squats, deadlifts, and lunges. Ideally, we want to be predominantly working our lower body. We have more muscle mass in our lower body. So in terms of that idea of building our muscle mass, because it helps us to store the blood sugar, helps us to increase our metabolic rate, so we burn through the calories faster. All of that, we want bigger muscles. So the muscles in our lower body are going to help us with that weight regulation. As women, we tend to want to do our arms and our stomach, and that's fine. We can do those. And definitely in terms of that life expectancy, just having strength in our arms is absolutely vital. But the majority I would advise, and particularly if you are, most people on the call were cyclists and runners, we want to be training the muscles we use most in those sports. We want to ideally be heading towards a lower rep range, so higher weights, lower reps. But if you've never strength trained in your life, absolutely do not go out and do 5 max effort reps of, a deadlift or whatever tomorrow. Start with where you're at and build up from that. But long term, we want to be doing fewer reps, higher weights. We also want to be, as I say, we can be more vulnerable to injury. Both we feel more pain, but we're more vulnerable to injury because our ligaments, our tendons aren't so stable. So we want to be doing some mobility work. We want to be doing some stability work. And I would always say that's the precursor to strength. Don't just go out and hit the heavy weights. We need to make sure we've got the mobility to move, the stability to stabilize our joints as we do that strength work. I'd also recommend adding in some plyometrics, so some low-level jumping about, multi-directional. Even if you're a runner, we want to get that multi-directional stress through to the bone to help build our bone density. Balance work, I see when I teach my classes, if people don't work on their balance is generally appalling, and it gets worse as we get older. Just add in some balance work, stand on one leg, wave the other leg around while you're brushing your teeth. You do it every day anyway, add in that balance work while you're doing it. Pelvic floor, I've given you some of those stats. Don't wait until you have a pelvic floor issue to work on it. Work on strengthening the pelvic floor. If you do have issues, and there's lots of resources online, but if you're still having issues, see a pelvic floor physio. Get some specific advice to work on it. Our pelvic floor is vital, not just to stop us from peeing ourselves, but it's also part of our core. So if we don't have that pelvic floor support from below, we can have issues in terms of that whole core stability. And then I can't remember if I added another slide on this or not. I might say this again. But we want to make sure that we don't just turn all of our training into just slow endurance training as we get older. We have this sort of tendency to go into the long, slow plod. So making sure we still keep some speed work in there, some short, sharp intervals to maintain that speed in our training. And I realized I haven't talked about endurance training on here at all. Somebody last night when I did this talk in York was like, oh, shouldn't we be doing endurance training? Yes, 100%. I'm taking it as read based on knowing who's on the call that most of you are doing the endurance training, but let's make sure we get the strength training in there as well. Common issues, and I saw when I asked what you do, lots of people are already doing strength training. So hopefully I don't need to kind of answer too many of these questions, but common issues when I talk to particularly women about strength training, women worry about bulking up. That is not what we're worrying about here. We're worrying about the fact you're losing muscle. Your hormones are going to be taking you towards this path of losing muscle. So we're just trying to maintain the muscle. If you don't like the gym, and I get that gyms can be very intimidating places, lots of men sweating and grunting and whatever, but have a look around you. There's so many female-only gyms now, or gyms that have female-only times. Maybe going with a friend. If you have the ability to work with a personal trainer, they can both help you with your technique, but also just help you kind of get to know the gym, feel comfortable in there. If you don't know what to do, the next slide will help you on that. But again, working with a personal trainer is brilliant. If you can't do one-to-one sessions, could you do classes where you can get some advice on how to do the training? If you prefer Pilates and yoga, if you're not doing any sort of strength training now, then absolutely go for it with Pilates and yoga. Ditto body pump. Body pump's great, but you're probably doing like 4 minutes of exercise, to last the track or whatever. I'm talking about trying to do lower reps, heavier weights. But all of those things are great. If you're already doing them, could you add in some stronger weights, some heavier weights? If you're not doing anything, then they are absolutely a brilliant start, but long-term trying to just add in a little bit more weight in there. And then again, most common thing is, yep, that all sounds great. I'll start next week. If that's fine, but make sure you do. Hold yourself to account on this. As I say, there's lots of advice in this presentation, so this might not be the main one for you, but it is one of my major recommendations. If you're not already strength training, seriously think about adding some in. If that's all a bit overwhelming, you don't know where to get started, I run classes every Thursday morning, and then I record them and post them on a private Facebook group where we do absolutely, I think, everything that was on that slide before. Everything in there is included in those classes. They're an hour-long class, but I divide it up so you could just do half the class if you wanted. I will, when I send around this recording, I'll send around a link to book if you're interested in booking into those classes with a 50% off offer for your first 2 months. You can also do a 14-day free trial on my website without that code, but I'll send you a code so you can book your first 2 months with 50% off. was I going to say something else? If you want to get an idea of what sort of stuff we do in there, on Menopause Awareness Day, which was back in October, I posted a session on my Facebook group. So that's on there free. So you can get an idea of the sort of stuff I'd be advising to do in terms of menopause training, or training that will help us through menopause. I did have this slide in here. So as I say, keep up the endurance training. I'm absolutely not saying don't do the endurance training, but do add in that strength work. And also, as I say, let's not go into this kind of long, slow plod. We need to keep in the speed and the power work. So short, less than 30-second intervals with long recovery, and keep on going. If you're doing those high intensity intervals in your running, be cautious. When we run faster, it has more impact. So if you're picking up injuries, maybe ditch the run intervals, do them on the bike. You could do kettlebell swings, you could do pretty much anything, but avoiding too much impact. We want some impact to strengthen our bones, but if you're picking up injuries by doing faster running, maybe see if you can do those intervals in a different sport. Remember, I think most people have got this now, but it's still so important to say, you can't spot reduce fat. So doing all the sit-ups in the world will not get rid of belly fat. If you want to get rid of fat, you need to do, like I say, the squats, the deadlifts, the lunges, those big muscle exercises that are going to help to burn the fat. You don't choose where you lose the fat from. And if you get injured, if you can, see a physio. So many people put off seeing a physio. If you see somebody sooner rather than later, often you'll only need that one appointment, and then they give you some advice to be getting on with, and hopefully you've solved the issue. So take home message, add some more strength work into your training. If you're already doing 5 days a week of strength training, you're fine. I wouldn't worry doing any more. Maybe could you go heavier, but you're probably good. But for most of us, we're probably not hitting those at least 2 sessions a week, ideally 3. So could you do some more strength training? Could you look at increasing the weight with good form? So don't do anything that's dangerous. Don't do it if you're not happy with your technique, but could you look at increasing the weight? So less reps, heavier weight. But don't become obsessed with that. I need heavier weights. I need heavier weights. Oh, I haven't got heavier weights. I can't do anything. Something is always going to be better than nothing. And then keep the injuries at bay with some mobility and stability. Okay, on to the next one. And if it's all right, as I say, I'll take questions at the end. I'm not checking the chat. So save your questions up and then we can ask them at the end. So on to the next one. Eating enough. Now, this will probably seem a little bit controversial because I've talked lots about how we put on weight through menopause, and you might be thinking, well, she said that we put on weight, so why is she telling me to eat more? If we underfuel our training, remember, when we train, we break down our body. My clients are so sick of hearing me say this, but you do not get fitter from training, you get fitter from recovery from training. So we break down our body and then our body rebuilds itself stronger. That's how we adapt, that's how we get fitter. If you're not fueling that process, you're breaking down your body, but you're not rebuilding. So you're risking injury and you're risking not progressing in your training. Secondly, you risk weight gain, and that sounds counterintuitive, but your body, remember our purpose, and I don't mean literally our purpose, but what from a what do you call it? Yeah, I can't think of the word, but the reason we were put on this planet is to reproduce. I 100% see women as much more than that, and you don't have to reproduce. But our point from I can't think what the word is, but anyway, our point is to reproduce. If our body sees that there's not enough energy there for us to reproduce, it is going to panic and it's going to try and save the resources it's got. If it knows that you keep on not giving it the energy it needs to go for that run, to go for that cycle ride, it is going to grab onto whatever you do, give it in terms of energy, and it's going to save it. And it's going to save it how it knows, in this fat that we lay down potentially, or more around our stomach. So by underfueling, we're potentially leading our body to want to put on, to save that fat, leading to weight gain. But then finally, just from a practical point of view, if you underfuel your training and you go out and you do a hard ride, a hard run, whatever, and you haven't taken on energy before you go, you come home, you're hungry, and you end up eating more than you ever planned to and not really making sensible choices because you're just starving and you walk in and grab what you can. So think about fueling your training. In terms of what I mean by that, our body, I haven't changed that slide, that should say 60 to 90, but our body has enough energy stored for about 60 to 90 minutes worth of training. If we've been fasting, and I wouldn't really recommend any menopausal women are fasting, but if you've been fasting, or just because you haven't eaten anything all day because you've been busy at work or whatever, or overnight, whatever, that will have gone down. If we're doing training that's above 60 minutes, or we're doing high intensity sessions, we will burn through what we've got stored. So If we're doing anything below that, below the 60 minutes of the high intensity, you're probably okay based on what you've already eaten. But if you're doing more than 60 minutes, if you're doing higher intensity sessions, I would strongly advise fueling. If you think, oh, but it's only 60 minutes, so I'll be okay. If you are tired, if you aren't making progress you would expect to be making in your training, or if you keep getting injured, try fueling. Women particularly are so resistant to fueling their training, and we feel that we kind of have to justify it. Give it a go and see if it gets you better results. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to end up with a calorie surplus compared with not taking it on. It's just going to fuel you to do the session, so you'll achieve more in your session. The other common objection I get is either I don't want, gels and stuff. I'm not talking about gels. I would say as you get towards a race, if you're racing, you probably want to get used to training with some gels. But here, I'm absolutely not talking about that. I'm talking about simple foods that are easy to digest. It could be a banana, it could be some dried fruit, it could be some flapjack. Particularly if it's an early morning session and you don't want to eat a whole breakfast. I'm not saying have your whole breakfast, but just something that's easy to digest. Rice pudding's one of my favorites. So that you've got something to fuel that training session. Secondly, make sure you're eating enough protein. I would say aim for at least 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. So I weigh about 60 kilograms. I need to make sure I'm getting at least 60 grams of protein a day. I would say probably higher than that for most people on this call, and particularly if you're doing heavy training, particularly heavy strength training, but particularly if you're doing long endurance sessions, closer to that over 2 grams per kilo of body weight. That's, as I say, as we go through perimenopause, we lose the protective effect of estrogen on our muscles and our bones. We become more catabolic. We start losing our ability to maintain muscle and bone. So we need to give that protein to help support, preserve what we've got in terms of the muscle and bone, and to help avoid injury, to help rebuild our body stronger. I'd be aiming for about 25 to 30 grams of protein in each meal. And then depending on how much you weigh and therefore, or how much you want to increase your protein by, if you're, as I say, doing lots more training, you want more than, you want to increase your protein per day. So think about some protein-based snacks that you can supplement with throughout the day. It's particularly important for women to try and make sure we get protein in within 30 minutes post-training. So men have a much longer recovery window. For us, it's much more effective to get protein in within about 30 minutes after you finish a session. Not every single session. If it's a gentle yoga session, that's fine. But if we're doing something hard, then getting that 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes. And ideally with 3 grams of leucine within there. Leucine's a particular amino acid within the protein. If you have whey protein, 30 grams of whey protein will give you 3 grams of leucine. If you're not having whey protein, if you're vegan or veggie, you can still get it, but you need to just look into it with a little bit more detail. But do not overcomplicate it. So many people will say to me, oh yeah, I need to sort out my protein. And a year later, they're still going to be about to sort out their protein. I'm seeing some smiles as I'm looking. So most of us eat the same things most days. We have roughly the same thing for breakfast, probably a similar thing for lunch. Tomorrow, when you make your breakfast, have a look at the packet, have a look at how much protein is in there per 100 grams or per serving. If it's only per 100 grams, weigh what you're eating and work out what proportion of that 100 grams it is. Now you know how much protein was in there. Do that for whatever you're including in your breakfast. You only have to do it once and you know, did that hit your 25 to 30 grams? If not, how much extra do you need to make it up for? And have a think about some other ways you can get that either within that meal or something else in the day. So just work out your common meals, roughly, it doesn't need to be precise, roughly what you're getting in, what the shortfall is, and what your plan is to do to deal with it. Here's a quick sample of different things that you might eat and how much protein is in there. Again, you'll get the slides through so you can look at it in more detail. Just a note to vegetarians. I'm used to be vegetarian. I'm still mostly vegetarian, but be aware things like chickpeas and lentils, which are great whole foods and great sources of protein, but you're only getting about 8 grams per serving. So if that was your main protein for the evening, think how you're going to make up that sort of shortfall to get to that 25 to 30 grams. Third one on food. Look to swap your refined carbs for whole grains, fruit and vegetable. So when if we're just having refined carbs, and I'm sure none of us are just having refined carbs, but when we have refined carbs, so sugar, for example, or a processed meal, it comes in The sugar comes in, and as I said, we've already kind of losing some of our insulin sensitivity as estrogen reduces. So we're finding it harder to manage our blood sugar. So we get this rush of sugar coming in, and our body, our hormones are finding it harder to deal with that rush of blood sugar. So A, we get these fluctuations in energy, but B, we can't take it out and store it in our muscles so easily. So we start storing it as fat. We know, we've been told since we were kids to eat a range of fruit and vegetable because of all the important vitamins and minerals. We need them for our everyday health. We need them to support our training. Fruit and vegetables particularly are anti-inflammatory. Perimenopause is a highly inflammatory time. Our hormones are going haywire, they're going up and down. Our body likes homeostasis, and so it's trying to get us back to this kind of constant, but everything's going haywire. So we have this highly inflammatory effect going on in our body. Fruit and veg, particularly things like berries, can be a really useful way to reduce that inflammation. And then finally, an area that we still are learning a lot more about, but what we know so far is that our microbiome, so the gut flora that lives in our intestines, our lower intestine, is vital for our immunity, for our digestive process, for managing inflammation, and for one other crucial thing that's completely left my mind, but for our mental health. Our mental health, there's so much research now linking our microbiome to our mental health, both in terms of our cognitive ability, but particularly in terms of just, are we happy or sad? Loads of studies showing people moving over to a whole grain fruit and veg diet reduce the rates of depression. So try and think about where we can, swapping out those refined carbs for more whole grains, fruit and veg. The magic number is 30. Can we get 30 different whole foods? That's fruit, veg, nuts, seeds, spices, whole grains, 30 different within a week. Try and frame this to yourself rather than restrict. I'm not allowed chocolate, or I'm not allowed the thing that you're kind of trying to move away from. Rather than focusing on restricting, try and focus on nourishing. What can we do to nourish our body to help it through this time when it's under more stress? Just a quick note on supplements. I'm not going to go into them in loads of detail. I find particularly in menopause or perimenopause, people tend to go for lots of different supplements, and that is fine. If you find they work for you, then absolutely fine, but just give them the same caution you would give other things. I think people tend to go, oh, it's natural, so it's okay, and it might well be okay, but nicotine's natural, morphine or opium's natural, doesn't mean it's good for us. Use the same judgment that you would use if you were taking something that wasn't natural. A really good place to look up things is examine.com. Loads of great peer-reviewed studies on there. If you're not sure about something, look up on there. It'll give you guidelines in terms of what to take, but also what it's good for. Where possible, try and get all the nutrition you need from your food. Food first. A, it's cheaper generally, but B, it's better absorbed by your body. If you are thinking of taking supplements, people tend to just go, oh yeah, I'm going to take an iron supplement. I would always test for it. Make sure that you're not overdosing by taking on too much. Make sure if you need to be taking it. But if you are particularly suffering from fatigue, I would always get you to check your iron levels, make sure there's not an issue there. Magnesium is another one. So we lose magnesium in our sweat. We lose magnesium when we're stressed. Perimenopausal active women tend to be doing a lot of sweating and getting stressed. So there's a chance that we are deficient in magnesium. Magnesium particularly is important to help us sleep. So if you're having trouble sleeping, you might want to get tested in terms of magnesium and look at supplementing. The two exceptions I would probably say that you don't necessarily need to test for. Number one, vitamin D. In this country, particularly in the winter, we are highly, highly likely to be deficient in vitamin D. We need sunlight to make vitamin D. And the other one, which is big in the strength world, not so kind of common in outside of the strength world, creatine monohydrate. There's more and more evidence coming through showing that it can be useful, particularly in brain fog. And lots of people are saying that brain fog is one of their biggest issues. If you look on examine.com, it will give you the kind of dosing guidelines, but creatine monohydrate can be quite useful there. Caution, if you have heart or blood pressure medication, I wouldn't be taking, or I'd certainly be taking advice. So on the eating, key take-home message, fuel your training. If there's nothing else that you hear from it, fuel your training. Secondly, eat enough protein, so at least that gram per kilo of body weight, probably up to 2 grams, and try and make sure your diet is based on whole foods. Final point, and this should be the easiest. This is the bit where we get to sit back and rest. This should be the easiest bit of advice to take. This is probably the one that people find hardest. So we need to recover. What do we need to recover from? We basically need to be recovering from stress. We know the kind of common things that stress us, things like our family, work, money, the news, particularly at the moment. But then we get to perimenopause and we have this hormonal imbalance. Our hormones are changing. Our body is desperate to bring us back to homeostasis, back to everything being the same, but it can't because the hormones are fluctuating and changing. So we're going through an incredibly stressful time in our body, and we start having a more stressful reaction to things that happen. We know that we get more stressed. We're not sleeping so well. We get higher anxiety. So we end up with this kind of stress cycle developing. Then we add in all these other things which also stress our body. Our training can be a massive relief for us, great for our mental health, but it is a stress on our body. Inflammatory foods stress our body, underfueling stresses our body, lack of sleep is all contributing to this increase in stress on our body. Stress isn't a bad thing per se, but the problem is when it gets out of balance. So we need to balance our stress and our recovery and make sure that if stress is increasing, we're either increasing our recovery or finding a way to decrease the stress to maintain that balance. But as the stress gets bigger, we need to think how we're going to come back to that balance. In terms of recovery, people love to talk about the modalities, the massage, maybe not so much the foam rolling, but the ice bath, the cold water, the compression socks, the Theraguns, all these things we can do to ourselves to help ourselves recover. And they're all great. I'm absolutely not against them at all. But the things that will have way more impact and really we need to take seriously are time between our training sessions. So if we've done a hard session, we need time for our body to recover before we ask it to do another hard session. And time just simply to do nothing, to de-stress, to relax. We need to make sure we're giving our body what it needs in terms of diet. We've just looked at that already, but fuel our recovery through having enough carbs, carbohydrates, protein, and those vitamins and minerals. And we need to see how we can actively work to reduce our stress response. In terms of training recovery, a question for you just to think to yourself, is your goal to do as much as possible right now, or is your goal to stay healthy and active for longer? And it's not a zero-sum game, it's not an either or, but we always want to push ourselves, we always want to do more. And sometimes that is counterproductive. That's not helping us with that long-term health benefit. Maybe we need to ask ourselves, do we need to accept that we can't do everything that we did before? That's not about giving up and saying, I'm over the hill now, that's the end. But do we need to think about doing a bit less or less hard sessions, or at least thinking about building in some more rest? There's no answer, there's no specific answer to that, but it's about learning what works for you. In terms of the mental stress, and as I say, as we go through perimenopause, that mental stress starts going up. When we lived out on the plains and the saber-toothed tiger was the main threat, our bodies adapted to have different hormonal responses to help us be ready to essentially run away from the saber-toothed tiger. If we saw a threat, our heart rate would go up, our blood pressure would go up, the adrenaline started circulating, all of which was about helping us be ready to run away from that saber-toothed tiger. And at the same time, we didn't need to be worrying about digestion. We didn't need to worry about that insulin sensitivity. I'm sure you've all heard of rest and digest. Rest and digest is what we do when we're sitting down doing nothing. If the saber-toothed tiger's there, we need to go into fight or flight. So our hormones are changing to allow us to run away from the saber-toothed tiger. There is no saber-toothed tiger anymore, but our body reacts in exactly the same way as it did back then. So when we get the email from our boss saying, could you come in and have a meet, could you come into my room? I need to talk to you about something, and our heart goes through the roof. When our train gets cancelled, when the traffic's bad, when the kids are playing up, all the things that stress us, our body goes through that same process. And if we keep repeating that time after time, day after day, more and more as we go through perimenopause, because we have these higher stress hormones circulating, but we're starting to get more anxious, we're sleeping less, we're just into this whole cycle, and it has a long-term impact. We feel crap at the time, but it has a long-term impact on our health, our weight, our performance, our sleep, loads of other things you can see on the slide there. So we need to learn how to manage that stress so that we don't go into that whole stress cycle every time, or if we do, so we can bring ourselves down. Some of the most common tools I'm sure you're aware or familiar with for helping to calm yourself down are alcohol, food, drugs, scrolling on your phone, exercise. However, I wouldn't necessarily recommend turning to those. Some of those, as you know, have negative impacts, but also we're not dealing with the root cause. So rather than just commonly turning to those things, if we find ourselves getting stressed, let's think about things we can do which will actually help to reduce that stress. So number one, breathing. If you're happy to just have a go, I'm going to just take you through a breathing exercise now. So if you want to close your eyes, close your eyes. If you don't, leave your eyes open, absolutely fine. And we're just going to practice breathing in and out. So if you breathe in slowly, in through your nose for the count of 3. So 1, 2, 3. And then out even slower. So out for 5, 3, 4, 5. Back in for 3, 1, 2, 3. And then out for 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, in for 3, 2, 3, out for 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you carry on with that breathing pattern, or if that feels a bit too slow for you, find what works for you. But with that longer breath out, and as you do the breath out, try and focus on relaxing wherever you hold tension. We all have places we hold tension. It might be your jaw, it might be your shoulders, it might be your core, it might be your sort of squeezing your legs together, your pelvic floor, your fingers. Wherever you hold tension, try and focus on relaxing it, just feeling it leaving your body as you breathe out. And then if we come back now, so hopefully, and that's only a minute or so, you can hopefully feel some of the positive impacts there, hopefully feel how it helps to de-stress you. If you can use that when you start feeling the stress rising, it's a really powerful way to relax yourself. So next time you see the indicator board coming up saying your train's been cancelled, you're stuck in traffic, just practice that slower breathing to calm yourself down. And as you do that slower breathing, if you do a longer out breath, it sends a really powerful message to your nervous system. There is no saber-toothed tiger there. It can relax. You can also use it if you know you're going into something that's going to be stressful. So if you're doing a talk to a load of people online or something, doing some breathing practice before can help to calm you down before you go into it. Start to think about your thoughts. The thoughts that we have are not facts. They're things in our mind, but they are not facts. Especially again, as we go through perimenopause, we can start to go kind of catastrophizing. We see the worst in everything. We go to the worst possible scenario each time. Try and hold yourself to account. Check those thoughts and ask, is that actually true? And does it have to be true? Is there a way I can make it not true? Is there a way that, I've gone to that worst possible scenario, but how likely is that to happen? So start trying to change these automatic negative thoughts, this catastrophizing of your thoughts, and keep yourself calm as you go through those thought processes. When I say mindfulness and meditation, half the room groans and goes, "Oh, not this again," and half the room has a little smug smile on their face going, "Yeah, I know, it's great, isn't it?" Those of you who don't use it, I think we have this kind of vision of mindfulness and meditation as this thing, this amazing nirvana that we have to get to. And we tried it once, or how many times we tried it, and we weren't any good at it, and we gave up. Try and think of it less as a destination to get to and more as a process. If you sit there, calming your mind down, however much it feels like your mind's still whirring, if you are doing active work to calm your mind down, then that is helping you. There's loads of apps out there which are really helpful, or you might find helpful. If you don't want to try the whole mindfulness and meditation, try just being present. Try and notice again, where are your thoughts going? Are they rushing over to that kind of worrying about what's coming in the future, worrying about what's happened in the past, and instead just try and live in the present. And some of you will be sick of hearing me say this, but my kind of tool just to come back to, if we're dreading something, if something's hard, if we just want to try and find a more positive way of seeing the world, get your 5 fingers out and find 5 things to be grateful for. That could be about your day. That could be about something you're dreading. You've seen your relatives at Christmas and you really don't want to. 5 things to be grateful for. It could be in your training. Reflect at the end of your training, whether it went well, whether it was an awful session. 5 things to be grateful for. It's not about toxic positivity. It's not about saying everything's great when it isn't, but it's helping to change that negative bias that we have in our brain round to something that's going to support us better. And then movement, loads of people use exercise to de-stress, and it's absolutely valid, and it's a really, really useful. Movement is absolutely key for us and is really, really useful in helping to de-stress. But my challenge to you would be, when you are doing exercise, are you doing it to find peace, or are you doing it to drown out the thoughts? And if it's more of that latter, then see if you could change it more to being about finding peace and using some of the thought stuff, the breathing stuff I've talked about, to help you find that inner peace. Final one, sleep. So sleep is absolutely vital for our recovery, both our physical and our mental recovery. You know, when you've had a bad night's sleep, that you can't, you know, your mind goes haywire, you can't think, but it's also when our body physically recovers. If we're not sleeping well enough, it impacts on our mood, our increased anxiety, our cognitive performance, our mental performance, and our physical performance. And there's a real high correlation with less sleep and putting on weight. And great news, it gets harder in menopause. As well as that sort of increased anxiety we've talked about, we get the night sweats and we get less melatonin, melatonin being a hormone that helps us sleep. So it's harder, but that doesn't mean we should just stress about it. If we try and relax, it's, you know, rather than going, oh my God, I can't sleep, go back to the slide before, all that, the stuff in terms of the ways to calm our brain down, to help ourselves relax, to help ourselves be more likely to sleep. And then just to run through a few quick kind of tick lists, people put a lot of emphasis on the evening routine, your sleep hygiene, and that's absolutely, you know, really important. But I would say probably most important is your morning routine. Do you have a consistent wake time? Even if you slept badly the night before, have you got up at a consistent time? Every single cell in our body has a little clock in it, and if we get up at a different time of day every day, those clocks don't know whether they're coming or going. So let's help them know what the time is by having that consistent wake time. And then when you wake up, do you have exposure to light? Now, I know in the UK at the moment, you might be getting up and it's pitch black for the next few hours or whatever. So we can use, you know, lights in the house, but as soon as possible, getting outside, there's much brighter light that we get from being outside than inside. Even through a window, it's better to be outside. So getting some light exposure and some movement as early as possible in the morning. Throughout the day, are we looking at cutting out caffeine, ideally from about midday? Are we doing all the things I've just talked about to try and reduce stress? So are we doing that thought work, making sure that we're thinking about our thoughts, not letting them go haywire? Are we doing things like breathing to help reset our nervous system? And are we making time for our brain to have some downtime? If the only time it ever gets when you're not doing anything is when you try and go to sleep, it's then trying to process everything because it's not used to that, just having that downtime. So practice downtime so it's easier when you go to bed. In terms of the evening, we know we should, but we don't always do it, but reducing alcohol. Alcohol doesn't help you sleep. Alcohol basically helps you pass out, but it doesn't help you sleep. We want to have a cool room. We want to cut down on the blue light, the phone, and it's not just about cutting the blue light. It's not doing work until midnight, but with a blue light filter. We need to stop our brain from being active at least 60 to 90 minutes before we go to bed. If you are having real problems sleeping, then CBT for insomnia is one of the best methods for people, particularly in perimenopause, to work on sleep. And pushing back our sleep time. We need to go to bed when we're actually sleepy. So if you're not sleepy, try pushing it back a bit so you get in the habit of actually falling asleep when you go to bed. Okay, that is it. Here is a summary of my suggestions of things to focus on. So like I said at the beginning, don't try and do everything. Start with where you're at. If you haven't made any changes in the area of exercise or diet or rest, then start at the beginning. If you've already done those, try going on to the next step, go on to the next step. Don't try and do everything. Don't even do all of those first steps. Do one this week, do one the next week or whatever. Maybe take a photo or save the slide when I save it round. Save it in your diary to come up every week or every month to remind you to check in and see, have I done this? Am I ready to progress? But don't try and do everything in one go. And those of you, if you do have a coach, absolutely, I presume your coach is talking to you about all these things, but if they're not, speak to your coach. Make sure this is part of your training plan, that you're building these things in. In terms of more information, British Menopause Society is a great source of information. I can never say the words here. Pelvic Obstetric and Gynecological Physiotherapy Association, another good one. The Balance app's great for recording menopause symptoms on, and there's loads of information on there. The Hit Play Not Pause podcast, it's from the States, but it's absolutely brilliant. I love it. Loads of great information on there. And then those are some of the books which I refer to a lot in terms of menopause and female training in general. In terms of any more support I can give you, I'm going to do a drop-in call on the 29th of November at midday. You'll get the details in the email send round. So today's probably been a bit of an avalanche of loads of information. Take it away, have some time to think about it, and then when you get time for questions now, but if you'll probably have questions come up when you start thinking about it a little bit more. So come to that drop-in call. No agenda, just come in, ask any questions you've got. If you can't make that, or if you want to talk in more detail, you can always book a free call on my website. If you go to the How Can I Help section of my website, and you can book in a 20-minute call on there. Again, I'll put links in the email I'll send round. And I put loads of information on social media at Feel Fit with Lucy. So on to questions. I'm going to finish the recording